Hello, biology students. So today we're going to talk about respiration. Before you watch this video, I want you to watch the Amoeba Sisters video that's linked to your hyperdoc called Cellular Respiration. So please watch that one first. After you've watched that, then please watch this video. We're going to go through the kind of the main parts of cellular respiration. So some of you maybe thought the point of eating food was just to make your stomachs full. Well, it's not. You actually need to break down the food to get energy into your cells for the production of ATP. So I know we compare equations, and remember with photosynthesis, we used energy from sunlight and some water. Plants took in carbon dioxide through the stomata, and then it made glucose, and then oxygen gas was released as a byproduct. And cellular respiration is just kind of the reverse of that. It's going to take that oxygen and glucose that plants make, and for us, the glucose is broken down from the food that we eat, and then that glucose is broken down. It combines with some of the oxygen that we actually breathe in. And then we release as a byproduct carbon dioxide, which we exhale from our lungs. Some water is released into our bodies from this process, and then energy. But all of a sudden, energy, we're not talking about sunlight energy, we're talking about energy in the form of this ATP molecule. So ATP is the energy that's produced in our cells, and that's true whether in plants or animals or bacteria or anything. So this process is called cellular respiration, and it's just breaking down of organic molecules like glucose, or in our case, right, the food that we eat, to get energy to fuel cellular processes. Remember when we talked about the cell membrane? We said that there's some things that move through the membrane that require the use of energy in the form of ATP. Well, that's one of the places that ATP is used, but there's actually a lot of cellular processes that need to be fueled by ATP. So the Amoeba Sisters video mentions that the first phase of cellular respiration is glycolysis, and glycolysis is really just breaking this glucose down into two pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules. Pyruvate and pyruvic acid are the same thing. It's just two different names for the same thing. This happens in just the cytosol, or sometimes we say cytoplasm. I gotta pick a different color pen. That's terrible. In the cytosol or cytoplasm, remember cytosol is just the gel by itself. Cytoplasm technically is that the cytosol with the organelles floating in it. So the point is, this occurs outside of organelles. It results in the production of a couple of those ATP and you don't have to write this down, but some other carrier molecules that we're going to kind of see their purpose in a little bit later on here. Technically, this produces 4 ATP, but usually 2 of them are used up in the process. That was mentioned in the video. So we say net production. So the difference between gross and net, it's sort of like if you have a job and you get a paycheck, your gross pay is what you make. So if you have a job making, let's say you make $30 an hour, let's say that you're making the big money, you don't get to take home $30 an hour unless you happen to be working for cash, and then technically you're supposed to claim it later and all that kind of stuff. You're going to have to pay in Social Security, you're going to have to pay in some taxes, and so what you actually get to bring home is your net pay. So if you think of your paycheck as this big stash of money, and if you scoop it up with a net, some of the stuff is going to fall through the net. So what you actually get to bring home is what stays in your net. I think that's kind of a good analogy. So anyway, in this process, a net of 2 ATP are produced. And again, usually it's not going to be the same every single time. So I actually kind of like this visual right here because this is kind of an overview of what we just talked about and what we're going to talk about next. So glucose gets broken down into pyruvate or pyruvic acid. That's the first stage. And then, depending upon whether oxygen is present or not, so we say that aerobic means with oxygen. So aerobic respiration means that oxygen is present. Anaerobic respiration means there's no oxygen present. So something else has to happen because remember that formula used oxygen. So if there's no oxygen, something else is going to happen. This is where we're either going to get some ethanol, which is an alcohol production, along with CO2, or lactate. And we're going to talk about why that's a bad thing for athletes. If oxygen is present, I hope you all know what this organelle is. Somebody should shout it out. I'm not going to tell. Oh gosh, never mind. It's right here. Just kidding. It's the mitochondria. So in order for this process to happen with oxygen, or oxygen has to be present in order for this to move into the mitochondria. So this is a handy little chart. I would actually put this in your notes. Organic compound is broken down into through the process of glycolysis. Again, this happens in the cytoplasm, produces pyruvic acid. If oxygen is absent, it stays in the cytoplasm. If oxygen is present, it diffuses into the mitochondria, and this is where aerobic respiration is going to occur. And it's going to make a whole bunch of ATP, and we're going to talk more specifically about these processes. If no oxygen is present, oxygen is absent, this stays in the cytoplasm. It doesn't go into the mitochondria. It stays in the cytoplasm, and we get fermentation and anaerobic respiration. So let's talk first about that anaerobic pathway. So anaerobic literally means without oxygen. We said this leads to fermentation, and it's not going to produce any more ATP. It needs the oxygen to produce the ATP. So in the absence of oxygen, we have glucose produce 2 pyruvic acid molecules and a little energy, but not very much of that ATP. What we do have happen is lactic acid fermentation, which lactic acid fermentation happens in your muscles. If you are an athlete, you'll notice if you work really hard, if you run cross country and you're running a race, or you play football, or you're volleyball or swimming or whatever it is, and you really get that heart rate up and you start breathing really heavy, it's because your body is saying, hey, we need more oxygen in here. You need to get more oxygen in your body. And so it triggers your body to breathe in more deeply and more frequently to try to move that, boost those oxygen levels. But there's still probably going to be some lactic acid buildup in your muscles because there's probably some areas where you're just not going to be able to get enough oxygen to your muscles. So that lactic acid buildup is why sometimes muscles get sore. That's one of the reasons why it's important to drink a lot of water and to do lots of stretching after intense physical activity. The other thing that can happen, alcohol fermentation. So this is the production of ethyl alcohol. This is actually how wine and beer is made. It's actually why yeast causes bread to raise. That fermentation and production of CO2, but there actually is a little bit of alcohol produced in that process as well. So again, this doesn't produce a lot of ATP. This is not the goal. So the goal in our body is obviously aerobic respiration. We want that oxygen. We want to produce all of this ATP. Aerobic respiration produces nearly 20 times as much ATP as anaerobic respiration. So this is what we want. We want that pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules to diffuse into, this is the mitochondria. And remember we talked about those cristae, all those little folds, and how important it was. What actually happens here is this increases the surface area so that more of that ATP can be made. There's also a concentration gradient that builds up between the outer membrane and kind of this inner membrane, which powers that ATP synthase, which is the enzyme that makes ATP. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But pyruvic acid generated in glycolysis diffuses into the mitochondria. This produces a NADH molecule. This is actually a carrier molecule. And then the Krebs cycle is the first stage of aerobic respiration, and we're going to go through the process a little bit more. I know I'm going really fast. Please pause this if you need to. So here's kind of a visual that kind of explains it too. So glycolysis, again, the pyruvic acid or pyruvate diffuses into the mitochondria. So here we see the Krebs cycle, and it shows ATP being produced. So sometimes this is called the citric acid cycle. And then there's kind of a third phase, that's the electron transport chain. And this is really where most of that ATP is made. So this Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle, now we see, so far, because we get 2 more ATP here, and then some NADH, which are carrier molecules. They're just carrying energy into the next stage to make more ATP. So now we have 4 ATP and then a bunch of those carrier molecules. But that's not really enough. I mean, that's not enough to keep our cells alive. So this electron transport chain, which is kind of that third phase, so the electron transport chain, where most of the ATP is made, works because it builds up a concentration gradient of protons, which are hydrogen ions that have lost their electron, basically, between the inner and outer mitochondrial membrane, and this drives actually the formation of that ATP. So I like to think of this, so this concentration gradient, remember nature doesn't like a concentration gradient, so if we have a whole bunch of protons here, and there's not as many protons on this side of the membrane, remember this is the mitochondria, nature doesn't like that. It's sort of like how lightning happens, you know. If this is a cloud, let's say there's a cloud in the sky, this area in the sky that has a big buildup of positive charges, and there's another area, you know, that has a big buildup of negative charges, and this is what happens, you know, kind of during thunderstorms. Nature doesn't like that, so this huge release of energy happens, and some of the negative charges flow this way, and some of the positive charges flow this way until they're equaled out, and that we see as a lightning bolt. That's actually what a lightning bolt is. Think of how much energy is involved in that. Imagine that happening on a super, super small scale inside of your cells, and that energy actually produces ATP with this ATP synthase enzyme. So this is the quick overview. So up to 38 ATP molecules are made from each molecule of glucose. And remember, most of those are made in that electron transport chain.